what you're saying, Afghans being sold out. You could say some Iraqis at different periods.
the Kurds, the Iranians.
Yeah, you'll disagree with this, but I say Palestinian people.
I wouldn't disagree with you at all. To the contrary, I think we have possibly sold them out the worst by doing such an awful job with their leadership and governance, which was meant to be the thing that we paid for and were responsible for in this great peace process.
Welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis, a series of casual conversations on the most important events in the Middle East region today. I'm Brian Katulis. I'm MEI's Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy, and today I'm joined by my friend Danielle Pletka. Danny, we'll call her on this. She is a distinguished Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm going to ask you about your origin story in a second, but I want to see if we can both recall our origin story, our professional relationship. Where did we first meet?
Tel Aviv.
Yes. We were debating, what was the topic?
Don't remember.
So we were debating at the Herzliya Security Conference the question of, can Israel live with a nuclear Iran?
And you were in favor?
2011. I was on the tag team. It was a tag team debate. Remember this? I had.
You were Ephraim Sneh.
No, you had Ephraim Sneh.
God. I do remember.
And I had Ephraim Halavi, the former Mossad chief. And this was 2011. And think about it. We're in 2024 today. And this is still a very relevant question. Can Israel live with a nuclear Iran? And you were no. And
You were yes?
Well,
no.
I basically said that we shouldn't have to because we're the strong
horse. Osama.
But we're stronger and things like that. That's where we met. But basically, since then, though she detests a lot of my policy views on certain issues, I have strong opposition to some of your views, and we express this in many different forums. But after that debate, we went out for a drink with a couple of friends on the beach in Tel Aviv. And then for about 10 years, I was at the Center for American Progress, and you would host me at events where we talked about how bad the Iraq War was and what a big mistake it was.
I don't think we said that.
Over at the American Enterprise Institute. But the policy for on Iraq and then a broader region became branded as this dual containment of both Iran and Iraq. And you were in the Senate. I forget when you left from the Senate.
I left in 2002.
2002. Okay. So right before the Iraq War. But you were there for about a decade and a half almost.
A decade.
Yeah, about a decade or so. Let's stay in the 90s and then we'll move forward. When you think about that moment in the Middle East, I often talk to Arab diplomats and people around the region, and they look back at 91 and they say, look, you guys just won the Cold War. You won a quick war in the Middle East. You use that. You knew where you're going. You didn't have rivals. And you flash forward to today, and we'll get to today in a second, but it's a much different moment where America is less clear about what it stands for in the world and in the Middle East. And we'll talk about the divisions in a little bit. But when you look at the bigger picture in the 1990s, in the Middle East, but then globally, when you think about what were the missed opportunities, what were the biggest ones that you think of, and why did that happen?
If we stay in the 90s, we should have ousted Saddam from power at the end of the
91 in the Middle East.
At the end of Desert Storm. Because we wouldn't have had the conceits that we had, and I had, in 2003, which is that we could do a really good job with the post-war political environment. We suck at that, it turns out. And that doesn't mean I don't support what we did. I just think we could have done a much better job.
Right.
But George H.W. Bush and James Baker were Republicans of the very, very old school, and they would not have had any
So they
compunction.
were more traditional balance of power.
They would have found, guy who looks like Saddam, but is more pro-American and going to get rid of all that naughty stuff that Saddam has. And then, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Yeah.
You will be ours now. And that's, I think, how that would have ended. So it would have changed history. So that's one thing that happened. Obviously, we ended up putting troops in Saudi Arabia, and that, while I don't think it had anything to do with the inception of Al Qaeda, it was certainly a talking point for Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
something else hugely important, and it'll resonate with all of the audience, just because I know that all of us care about this, but it's not strictly in the Middle East. One of the things that I really contended with right when I started was the disgrace of our abandonment, once again, of Afghanistan.
Uh-huh.
What had happened was, of course, we had really supported the Mujahideen, all of these Islamist fighters inside Afghanistan, with the coordination help, thank you so much, of Pakistani intelligence. And we had together defeated the Soviets.
Right.
And this was really the nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union. And while we were busy dancing a tap dance on the grave of the Soviets, we were like, Afghanistan, thank you so much for your service. Drop dead.
Right.
And what I had watched both as a journalist, but then when I came to Capitol Hill, was the US government cutting further and further back our support, until I was holding for dear life, like a cartoon character with my nails on the last 10 million sad dollars we were pouring into Afghanistan for assistance. This is a country that had been ravaged by the Sovs, had been absolutely devastated by the war, and we were just like, thanks so much for your service.
And that's a part of you. Like when we started to do some projects together, I was at Center for American Progress, you were at AEI, that I didn't fully appreciate when we first met, which was not just the Afghan people, but your empathy for Syrians, for a lot of people who are left behind in these conflicts. And I remember back in, it would have been second Obama administration, I think we did a joint piece in Politico about the Syria crisis.
Oh my God.
And it's still a feature today, and obviously with the immigration debate that we have today as it is.
And yet no one cares.
Yeah.
I mean, you care.
Yeah.
I care. And there are people who do great work on this at the Middle East Institute. Really shout out absolutely to Charles and others who have really...
Charles Lister, that is, yeah.
Charles Lister, but Robert Ford, who did this as well at the time. A lot of people who did great work. Charles is obviously still here. And no one gives a shit. It's the grossest thing.
Why is that? Why do you think that is? Because it's not a new phenomenon. Like for what you're saying, Afghans being sold out. You could say some Iraqis at different periods.
The Kurds, the Iranians.
Yeah, you'll disagree with this, but I say Palestinian people.
No, I wouldn't disagree with you at all. To the contrary, I think we have possibly sold them out the worst by doing such an awful job with their leadership and governance, which was meant to be the thing that we paid for and were responsible for in this great peace process. But anyway,
but why is it? The big question is why? Why does the U.S. foreign policy system or politics of this? It certainly has not gotten better. It's gotten worse. And I've written about it in certain ways. I call it neo-Orientalism, where the Orientalism that Edward Said talked about, where Western powers project their ideas on these places. Now I think the neo-Orientalism is that we use these people as props in our own social and political fights. But I don't know how, it's only why, but then how can you fix this given the nature of our immigration debate? When I went to the region for the first time in 1993 and got to know the people of the region, and you see that people are people and they just want to have a decent life and their families and things like this. And
not all of them.
Yeah.
But yes, most of them.
But no, but I mean, yeah, certainly there's extremists over there as there is here. But when you see the consequences in part of the policies of governments over there, first and foremost, and movements and but then also the consequences of U.S. action and inaction, I would add to it. Yeah. We're talking about it has displaced people, has pushed people out. We've sold people out in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq, in Palestine, and in other places. Why is that? And what can we do to fix that, given the trends about the discussion we're having in this country about immigration?
I mean, you're 100% right that the question of immigration only gets solved by looking at the problems in these countries. Sure, we can shut down our border, and that's fine, and the problem will get solved here. Okay, that's great for America, and I fully support having a very well-regulated border and having immigrants who go through a process. That's not the issue. The issue is it's also Europe, it's also Latin America, it's also, all of the Syrians, poor people who are living in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, it's not just about borders, and it's not just about America and Europe. Why do we do this? Look, I say to people, and I say it with pride as an immigrant, the American people are the best people in the world. When you look at a foreign disaster, the tsunami, when you look at people being oppressed, there is nobody who will stand up faster than the Americans. There's nobody who will reach into their own personal pocket faster than Americans. There's no soldier who will stand up faster to injustice than an American soldier. But as a matter of national policy, we have the attention span of a gnat.
So it's because of ADD or something that we can't, that goodness that you're talking about at the societal level.
We move
I see this. I'm from central Pennsylvania, and one of the places that has welcomed immigrants from the most recent wars and conflict is Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. A lot of people don't realize that. And it's in part because there are a lot of Christian groups that are there, and that's part of it. But what is that disconnect between our society and then the acrimonious politics, to the extent that we have, again, both parties using immigrants as props, and in some ways, some of the candidates talking about them in ways that people worry that dehumanize them. So why
are you talking about the cats again now? Yes. I think that it's true that I think it's true, and that's a mistake to ever dehumanize these people. They're running from something real. Look, even economic migrants are running towards something that our families were, as Mark Thiessen always says, we are a freaking nation of boat people. We are all boat people. The Mayflower was a boat. We are people who came over here looking for a better life. But look, my very personal family era is World War II.
Right.
And I look at America after World War II. We sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives fighting for what was right against Nazi Germany and against Imperial Japan and against, Mussolini, who kind of gave up fast. But sorry, I spent too much time with the Italians. And yet, after 1945, of course, we had the imperative of the Cold War. Of course, we had the imperative of Stalin. But I mean, our willingness to pay attention to what happened, our willingness to help, our willingness to continue to learn lessons learned after World War II was not as long held or as long standing as it should have been. And in each case, it's like that. I mean, to the good sometimes, but also to
carry
the
forward to today and then to the future. In 2025, you as a conservative, would you support a bipartisan effort to try to get special categories of visas in an organized system where people who have fought with us, who've been with us in Afghanistan.
Are you kidding? Of course, 100%. What is the disgrace of the Biden administration is how many people they left behind, including the people who I've talked about with you, who I work with, my close little adopted family. Dad worked with the army. Dad has a military ID in Afghanistan. That ID is now in the hands of the Taliban. The father of the mother and their two little girls, but you've got to vet them. Because it's one thing to work with people who are going to help you on the ground in Afghanistan, and it's another to let them into the country over which our president is commander in chief. That is your first responsibility. But of course, are you kidding? I wrote a piece with Steve Rickard, a very good, very old friend of mine who used to be the head of the Open Society Foundation and was at the RFK, whatever they call themselves, freedom thing, and was the head of the Amnesty office here. Right. He and I wrote a piece about how we should be allowing more Syrians in. Absolutely, but Obama didn't want to do that. Why didn't Obama want to let the Syrians in? I don't get it.
Well, it's, I agree with you that it's a national disgrace on Afghanistan, on Syria, on several of these instances where we don't take care of our own, essentially. These are people who fought with us or took big risks for the sake of freedom and their own freedom. And then we pull the rug out underneath them. And I don't understand. And it happened under Obama. It happened to a large extent under Trump as well.
Trump never made any pretense of being the Danielle Pletka of the Republican Party.
Yeah, that's right.
Barack Obama was a president of the Democrat and a Democrat.
Right. But the consequence is still the same. And even under Trump, I remember a number of people in his circles talking about the Christians of Iraq, for instance. And I was talking, we were at dinners and things like this.
Yeah.
Well, lo and behold, Christians from Iraq were deported from Michigan because of the policies that Steve Miller and others implemented. And again, that's a political trend here. And I guess what I'm trying to say, and we'll move to other topics here, is that I hope we can actually move beyond, learn some lessons from this, that yes, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East necessarily needs a strong defense and military component. It needs a much more effective diplomacy component. But what I argue in my soapbox here is it actually needs that human component too, where we need to come together across the aisle and help these people.
But you realize the American people are 100% with you. If you talk to communities, if you look at the Reagan Foundation does incredibly interesting polling every summer, and they're going to do another round. So they are polling Republicans.
Yeah.
And they, for the first time this year, they divided up MAGA Republicans from, run-of-the-mill Republicans, I guess you would call us. Anyway, what they discovered is that a lot of the issues that you and I are talking about today, actually, MAGA Republicans are more forward-leaning than like Nikki Haley Republicans, which to me says that this is just an absence of leadership. This is just an absence of people going to these folks and saying, hey, I want to bring Mohammed and his family. I am going to make sure that, the CIA and the military and the guys we work with and every other liaison service we can work with has nothing on them so that they can be a part of their community. Will you welcome them? And then the answer from every single American I know will be 100%. What can we do for them? How can we welcome them?
Yeah.
But that requires the kind of leadership we didn't see from Biden, we didn't see from Trump, and we sure as hell didn't see from Obama.
Right. Yeah. The other issue is that the decent Palestinian people, the ones that I know and I still am in touch with and put you in touch with them in Gaza, they don't like Hamas. They don't love, and they want something different, but they don't have voices in America's debate that actually.
No, they don't have advocates inside the U.S. government who are looking out for them, who want to talk to them instead of Abu Mazen, who want to talk to them instead of Hamas, right? Because Rob Malley, he wanted to talk to Hamas. The State Department wants to talk to the Palestinian Authority, and all the good people who are Democrats, nobody wants to talk to them. I'm with you, but that requires that we do something that America hates to do, which is quote unquote pick winners. If we want to do the right thing in the region, we need to identify the allies that believe in the things that we do, not because they're puppets of ours, not because they do what we say, but because they believe in the same things that Americans believe in. Right. And we are unwilling to do that under any administration. And that's why we keep losing.
Right.
Sorry.
No, but don't apologize. And it's not just picking a leader, but it's also trying to pick a way to help lift up the voices of decent Palestinians.
But institutions do that, Brian. This is why America lasts. We've had so many crappy presidents. It's not just Donald Trump. Oh my God.
And we may have another one.
I think we might. Although in either case, we certainly will. But we've had terrible presidents throughout history. We've had awful presidents. We've had a civil war, for heaven's sake. That is not what saves us. What saves us is our institutions. What saved us on January 6th was our institutions. What saved us when Bill Clinton perjured himself before the American people was our institutions. That is what we have given short shrift to as we have shoveled hundreds of millions of dollars towards the Palestinians. Is yes, of course, we advantage the security that the Israelis care about, but we never advantage any other aspect of institution building other than security. And we let them steal us blind, and we let them steal the Palestinian people blind. And we did it always with a smile on our face. That's why Hezbollah had that big, lovely bank in Beirut that nobody has broken into. That's why Yahya Sinwar had tens of thousands of dollars on him. This is what we need to do. It's not finding those individual voices. It's finding a place to live that protects them.
Yeah, that's where we agree. And that's where I think we can garner sort of the resources, the political capital, the relationship capital in this capital, Washington, D.C. in 2025 to actually do those things, because those are big things that take
kidding.
a lot of time, take a lot of money and expertise and knowledge that's out there. You're not building coalitions rather than fragmenting them.
You lose.
Yeah. And you lose in the world, right? And in the instances in the last 10 years, which Trumpsters or Biden folks don't like to admit, but there has been consensus building on key issues in the Hill, especially on Russia, on China, select committee. They're important.
We just had the chairman and the ranking member, Mark Thiessen, just hosted the chairman and the ranking member of the select committee at AEI, and they were great.
Yeah.
I just hosted Richie Torres and Mike Lawler on anti-Semitism, and they were great. And I mean, they are both from New York, so they're New Yorkers. But
right,
but you can,
but they're not outliers in their party too.
But you can do it. You can do this if you want to. The problem is nobody is interested in that good news story. Nobody is interested in making sure that this is the message. And yeah, it sounds sort of namby-pamby and oh, can't we all just get along,
Right.
But it's not at all that. But I would go further about this. When Donald Trump was president, Donald Trump's administration, ironically, had a lot of the same problems as the Obama administration, which is that they didn't really like to talk to people because nobody could speak for the principal.
Right.
In the Obama administration, there were just a few fancy people at the top, and they knew what the story was, and they talked to Barack. But nobody else knew. And so you'd try to meet with the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs or whatever, and they wouldn't really know what was going on. And they would generally avoid talking even to diplomats because they were embarrassed that they really couldn't speak.
Yeah, and that's the dynamic I get with officials all the time across administrations is two reasons they don't really tell you.
Right.
Is A, they really know something and they can't.
Right.
Or B, they don't know.
They don't know something. and they look dumb. And they would never want to admit that. And that, of course, was also true in the Trump administration. And I used to say to foreign embassies, you're so used to saying, America is trying to boss us around. America's not doing enough, and America needs to do more, or America needs to do less, but never, hey, here's an idea that we could do with you, and maybe we'll take the lead and you come along, because there was nobody who responded better to that than Donald Trump.
And that's the Abraham Accords.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet, I look at so lamentably lost Shinzo Abe in Japan, and he got that. Right. He didn't need any performance art for his people back at home, so I guess he was lucky enough politically, and he got along great with Donald Trump, and he got what he needed.
Yeah.
And it wasn't always what Trump wanted either. And our allies in Europe seemed not only incapable of this. When I said, you should think about what your agenda is and maybe try to, work your way towards it with a direct relationship with the president, they looked at me like I was speaking, Aramaic.
Yeah. When you look at the two presidential candidates and what they've stated on the trail, and again, my colleague Athena and I, we've put out, and we're about to put out another version of the Trump-Harris tracker, which is just displaying what they've said on these issues. Do you have any faith and confidence? Because going back to the earlier question of leadership, do we actually have that in the mix? Because I'm inferring from what you said is that the U.S. actually needs to play a much more engaged role, and that we actually need to. I've written this in this sort of way. Today's Middle East is kind of like 19th century America in the Wild West. And there are pockets of stability and prosperity. People are chasing gold in a big way. But there are also huge pockets of instability. And that a sheriff needs to round up an effective posse that is cohesive and is working together, because there are limits to what the United States can do while it's trying to help Taiwan defend itself, while it's trying to help Ukraine defend itself. That the notion, which sounds soft, but we need better language, of partnership with partners in Israel, in the Arab world, but they catch our lean. They catch a vibe when people know when somebody's a phony baloney, right? And whether
we are.
So when you look at sort of the options, and I'm not asking you to say who you're voting for or things like this, but
I've said that publicly already. So.
Yeah. What are you doing?
I'm not voting for Trump or Harris. Or Harris.
But on the
Harris.
I got you. I heard you. All right. but on the Middle East issues, do you see any pathway for the sort of leadership that, again, I inferred you think is needed? Because there's an alternative case out there. We've heard it from the left and the right. We've heard it from J.D. Vance when he spoke at certain institutes that say America does more harm than good.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Shame on them.
But that argument essentially says America should pull back from the region. We should pull back.
That is exactly the argument. J.D. Vance, this is the great unification of the fringes of both parties, where Kamala Harris goes out and says we should be ashamed of ourselves on Indigenous Peoples Day because America is an oppressor, racist nation. Oh yeah, you should read her speech. It's hideous. It wasn't given this year. It was given in 2021. And you then go out and see J.D. Vance saying, right, we should, we shouldn't be out there in these countries. They suck, and we should be here. And there is a great meeting of the so-called minds on this question. Do I see a horizon for leadership? You know what? I wrote this piece years ago in Foreign Policy, and I lamented it, and now it's my only hope. External events force us into action. And generally speaking, we make the right choice when we have to. Generally speaking, not always. That is the only thing I see that is going to galvanize us into some kind of action. Because the reality is, I'd love to say the Middle East is so hard, it's so complex, and you and I are really, we've really dived into it, and we know so much that everybody should just follow along the pearls of wisdom that you and I strew on the pathway. But of course, the answer is it's not that freaking complicated. We need to lead, we need to have values, we need to have principles, and we need to advantage people who share those values and principles. That's it. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to find them. We don't look for them. We often pick the tyrant, the attractive tyrant over the less attractive Democrat. Yeah. And the reality is we need to start making those decisions, but we need to also stick with it. Is that out of character? Yes, it's going to be hard. I'm not optimistic.
Tell us a little bit more about how you got into this line of work. You're a distinguished senior fellow at AEI.
I know, it's such an awful title.
Yeah. But what first sparked your interest in the Middle East? Because a lot of people who listen to us want to get into this line of work. What sparked it, and what did you do first?
I've always been interested in the Middle East. I think because my dad was very interested in the Middle East. My parents are both Holocaust survivors. And so for me, this was Israel was an issue near and dear to my heart, but also it was just the environment that we talked about. Also, how people will think this is funny, but there are just parts of the world that speak to you and parts of the world that don't. I love the Middle East. I went to Israel the first time in 1967. So a long time ago. I lived there in 1980, in 1982 and 3, and then also 4 and 5, with a year in between back at
What were you doing there in the 80s?
I was, this is really an origin story. I graduated from high school very young, and my father wanted me to take a year off school, and I didn't want to because school was where I was going to escape. So I instead took a junior year off. And my father was a visiting professor at Hadassah Hospital. And so I lived there and learned Hebrew and worked in a pen shop. That was really great, and learned how Arabs say Parker pen, which was a great introduction, Parker pen, to Arabic. And then later, when I was there the second time, I worked for Reuters as an intern, which was great. two great people, but especially the bureau chief, Ethan Bronner, old friend, really good, really smart.
Later on to the New York Times.
He went to the New York. He went to the Boston Globe. Then he went to the New York Times. He got pushed out of the New York Times because he was married to an Israeli woman, and one of his kids was in the IDF. It was an ugly, ugly story. Then I think he went to Bloomberg. I'm not sure where he is now, but a great journalist.
Yeah.
And then I went to the LA Times and worked for them as a local hire. So now I was their local translator, bill payer, everything. And then I went off to grad school. And I had not been, other than to Jordan and to Egypt, I had not been anywhere in the Arab world because it was really not what you did back in those days.
Right.
First time I went to a lot of the Arab world was after the Gulf War, when suddenly you could go to Saudi Arabia, you could go to Syria, and I went for more than a month to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, to Syria, and then obviously I went and worked in the government and spent a lot of time over there.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second, but I want to stay on this origin story. It's important for those who are listening, who are at the start of their career. When you were there in the 80s and interning with Reuters, and then you went on in LA Times, did you actually have a plan, or did?
Oh God, no.
Okay. And that's okay, right?
No. It's more than okay. I always tell, and like you working, at CAP and here at MEI, you work with tons and tons of young people, really, aspirational, smart, really good. And so I have spent years talking to people like that. And I always say the same thing. You've got to have a story. You've got to have a narrative about what it is you're interested in and what you're doing. But you absolutely don't have to stick to it. You just need to know what to say in the interview.
Right.
But you don't have to stick to it. You shouldn't stick to it. If I had had a plan, I would have gone to medical school, except for, of course, not being good at chemistry, physics, or math. But if I really had been rigid, I never would have gone to work for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
How did you get there? So how did you make the leap from being a journalist out in the region and getting some experience on the ground? How does this work for people who?
Well, I was lucky, but it wasn't just luck. It wasn't, because I'm so wonderful. It wasn't just luck, because I really had a great circle of sources when I was a journalist. And when I decided that I wanted to move on, I talked to them. Where should I go? What should I do? And the craziest part of this story is, I'm sure I've told this to you. I talked to Danielle Pipes, who was the head of the Middle East Forum and still has, I think, a role there. And Daniel called me up and he said, hey, I don't know anything about this, but my father, Richard Pipes, Daniel's father, now deceased, but was the senior director for the Soviet Union on the National Security Council in the Reagan administration.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So his boss had called him, his boss, who had been the deputy national security advisor, called him up and said, hey, do you know anybody to be on the Middle East staff at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee? We're firing everybody in a month. And I said, well, okay, I'll talk to them. And it was the first interview that they did with my soon-to-be boss, Admiral James Nance, who was the deputy national security advisor at the beginning of the Reagan administration, and the chairman's best friend from kindergarten, Chairman Jesse Helms.
Yeah.
And so they hired me. I wasn't an American citizen. And so I ended up working with the government. I was an Australian. And it was the greatest job. The most wonderful job, the most wonderful people, the most lessons learned. I'd tell everybody, even though it's not like it was then, that working on Capitol Hill is an incredible experience.
Just one last question about that leap you made and then the staff work, because you were on the Hill and became known to be quite powerful staff person with Jesse Helms. And I just read an article you wrote today Danny, by the way, has a podcast with Mark Thiessen called What the Hell is Going On? It's also a Substack, so you should subscribe to the Substack. It's really wonderful. And you had an anecdote in there about Helms and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And just tell us a little bit about that leap from a journalist to then working on policy.
Oh, my God. And not just a journalist and working on policy, but being a girl who, European parents, came to America, didn't go to university here, grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, the People's Republic of Brookline, Massachusetts, and then went to work for this Southerner from, I had never been to North Carolina.
Yeah.
the most I knew, and probably still know, about the Civil War, I read it in Gone with the Wind.
Because you won't watch Ken Burns documentaries.
I can't stand Ken Burns. And yeah, wow, it was real culture shock, but not in the way people thought. It was just fascinating. It was a great learning experience. But it was really different. You know, when you're a journalist, you're basically saying what you think. I mean, you're attributing it to sources say, well, critics believe, experts often comment, but you're fundamentally going to people with whom you mostly agree, or who are making an adversarial point that, you know, is relevant to your argument.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you're on Capitol Hill and it's a completely different kettle of fish. And
what does that kettle of fish look like on the Hill? Or at least when you were back there?
Look, the best part of it is that at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, what you are in charge of, what the chairman and the ranking member and the members are in charge of, is all foreign assistance that goes to, in this case, my region, which was then the Middle East and South Asia. So we're talking about Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and of course the always important Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Nepal, and the Middle East. And also all arms sales are being notified to you.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you get a security clearance and you meet AID, the Agency for International Development, the Department of State, Department of Defense, Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, and they're all part and parcel of your job.
Yeah.
I think the one thing to note that's different is that most committees on Capitol Hill, and this is really not a partisan question, most committees on Capitol Hill have very close relationships with the agencies that they oversee. The Intel Committee is very, very cozy with the CIA, and to a lesser extent with DIA. Armed Services is hand in glove with the Pentagon. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, generally speaking, have an adversarial relationship with the Department of State.
Right.
Because the Department of State doesn't like Congress telling it what to do. All of those great unelected people over there think that they are the deciders and you are the peons.
Right.
And that was not our perspective. So that was a really good time.
And I feel like we hit each other's nerves, and we were about to draw it to an end, but we have to draw it to an end. And I have to say thank you not only for your professional relationship that we've had for years, but your friendship, and for joining us on the taking the edge off the Middle East. That's all the time we have this week.
Thank you.
Thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and to our podcast producer, Elliot Sanders, Scott Zook, and Athena Mastoff here. You can follow MEI on X, we're calling it, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and you can subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Brian Katulis. We'll see you all sometime soon, I hope. Thank you.
Cheers.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.